Welcome to part 3 of this series. In this video we've got a new data set to look at as compared to the first two videos. This is a more generic fitness testing data set that contains all sorts of things from body weight and body composition through to speed, strength and power measurements. We have approximately 10 athletes and 4 test data sets. The way I've laid out this table I just want to spend a bit of time talking about. So the first 4 columns: date, test label, athlete name and position. I've just put a yellow shading above them. They are descriptors. They can be used for sorting, filtering and categorizing our data. For example, you might sort by position, by athlete name, by test label or by date. Next to that we have some measures. This is the raw data that we've got: body weight, sum of 8, speed and so on. There's not a lot of value in filtering by this, although you can sort to show highest to lowest. The last variable is pretty much still a measure, but it is a derived measure. So it's a little bit different to the ones that have got green shading above them. It uses 2 of the measures, mid-thigh pull max force and body weight, to create a derived measure which is strength per body weight. And so when you're laying your table out, you could be justified for putting that next to the strength measure. So first you have the raw measure, next you have the derived one. The only downside to doing that is that it's harder to paste data into your table from somewhere else. So if you are collecting information using a piece of technology, often you can export out a CSV or an Excel file and you can just paste that data directly into a spreadsheet like this. If you've got columns interspersed, it's a little bit harder to paste directly in. But just wanted to draw your attention to the difference between a derived measure and a raw measure. Usually the only impact is in the data entry process, but sometimes people will type over a formula, and so it can be a good idea to identify by shading it a certain color or by putting it to the far right of the data table so that people don't have the temptation to just type numbers. Now this data table is formatted as an Excel table, and you can see that by the fact that there's a Tables Tools context menu available. If I click on Design, we can see that this table is called TBL Database. Just remembering I can be playing with the formats and styles and doing all sorts of things to it if I want, but knowing that it's an Excel table means that a pivot table is quite easy to work with. On the Insert tab we can click Insert Pivot Table. It's already selected our data set, it's called TBL Database. I want to put it on a new worksheet. The pivot table wizard appears and we need to drag the fields from the top section into the 4 quadrants below. This is going to be a group report, so I'm going to put test label in the filters, athlete name in the rows, and we can see the pivot table building underneath our working area. Just going to drag some like-minded variables together. The 2 speeds, power and relative strength in the mid-thigh pull. Because I'm inside my pivot table, this field list appears. If I click outside it, it disappears, comes back when I go back to it. Just want to drag it out the way for now because I want to do some editing to the table. Firstly, just number format. I'm going to change to a more appropriate number format for each variable. After I've made that change, then I'm going to go in and just edit these headings because they're a bit verbose for my liking. If I hit enter now, we're going to get an error message. What it says is that this field name already exists. Speed 5 meter is a column heading in our data table, so we can't use the exact same thing in a pivot table. But what I can do is simply add a space at the end or in the middle somewhere, and it then sees that as a unique heading and it allows it. So I'm going to quickly tidy up these headings and just choose an option here. What could be useful in this pivot table is to add another variable into it. I'm going to put position in as well. That makes the table look a little bit messy, but how about if I drag athlete name below position, we then get something that actually looks quite reasonable. I could choose this layout, or on the design tab I could change it to this layout. Doesn't matter too much to me, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. One more thing I want to do is put in subtotals. Show subtotals at bottom of group. And so there we are, there we have the attacker total. I can right click on that, and under field settings I could say I want custom, average, max and min. And below each group now I've got attacker average, attacker max and attacker min. That may or may not be useful. Obviously we've got a pretty small data set, so that's a little bit overkill, but you can see that there's some potential there for that to be useful. Take them all away except average, just so we can keep it simple. If I copy this pivot table and put it next door, my field list has disappeared, so I can bring it back on the Analyze tab by clicking on the field list button. And everything that I haven't already got in a pivot table, I'm going to put into this second one. So that is body weight, sum of 8, and yo-yo distance. And so now we have two pivot tables right next to each other. I've just got a little gap between them. If I'm on a PC, what I can do is insert a couple of rows up above, and while I'm inside one of the pivot tables, I can insert a slicer for test label. Bump up to 2 columns so that we can have a smaller slicer, and I think I tend to like a dark colored slicer. If I right click on it, there's an option that says report connections. I want to make sure that both of these two boxes are ticked, because that means that this slicer will interact with both of these two pivot tables at the same time. So I can click test 2 and both tables will update, or test 3 or test 4 and so on. And if I had charts drawn next to this, they will also be impacted on by the slicer. Mac version 2016 for Excel has slicers available. It doesn't yet have pivot charts, however, so compatibility is catching up, but it's not quite there yet. Let's just call this sheet Team Report. Go back to the database. I'm going to insert another pivot table to a new worksheet, and inside this wizard I'm going to start with athlete name up the top, test label down below. I'm going to put the same 4 variables that I chose before. And so that layout looks okay. We could go through and tidy this up again. First thing, I'm just going to select an athlete so the numbers make a little bit more sense. If I tidied up some of these column headings and formats, things would look a lot more compact. Let me go and do that. And so I can choose a different athlete, and I can see that everything updates nicely. That layout, if you've got lots of test variables that you want to include, might not be ideal. And so it's a little bit of a quirk of Excel, but I could drag test label up and then values down to the rows, and would get that table flipped around, and that would then actually allow us to put in some other variables too. And so it's a quite nice compact little report that if I click inside, I could go to the design tab and turn off those grand totals because I don't think they're a good idea. We've got a nice compact little layout that we could style up in a particular way. and actually do something with in terms of pumping out a report. But we've got test 1, test 2, test 3 and test 4 in there, and if we added more values they would just appear in additional columns to the right, so long as we right clicked on it and selected refresh. Any new data would get added in the same layout as we've got here. So that was quite a quick way to create an individual report that updates if I select a new athlete. Didn't however want to spend too much time on pivot tables because I don't like the inability to insert aggregate values such as team averages and things like that. That's why formula reports are my preference. So let's go to the database and start having a look at how we might make that work. And so for each athlete here we've got approximately 4 fitness tests. So let's go and build ourselves a little report using formula. So we've got a blank sheet here called formula report. Just going to leave 2 blank rows at the top so that we can put a little title up there of some kind. I'm not going to waste any time on that. So let's get into it a bit further. First thing that we want to be able to select is our athlete name. Thankfully we've got a list of athlete names in a drop down box on our database sheet, so we could potentially go to that sheet, copy it and paste it in here. So we could just go paste and accept any formats that it's got, or we could go to paste value and choose validation. That would then give us those data validation rules, which is the athlete name. Now it's not big enough, so I'm going to select maybe across 3 columns and merge that, put a border around it and make it gold. This is what I do every time I put in a drop down box like that, just to make sure people understand. Next I want to put some column headings for our report. What I'm trying to create here is a selectable report. So let's put test and date in there. And there's one more thing that I want to do, and that is to go to the database sheet and select our test measures, both derived and raw. And with those cells selected, I'm going to create a name called list measures. Back in our report, let's choose 4 columns, data validation, list, and I can type it or select it by hitting F3. List measures. Let's continue with the trend that we used before: 5 meter speed, 40 meter speed, counter movement jump, relative strength, and expand that out, probably about double so that there's enough space. Can also select this row and wrap the text. I think that's okay to do so. Aesthetics can be really important to some people and not super important to others. Under test, let's allow the situation that they can have 5 options to choose a test data set. I know we've only got 4 at the moment, but let's pretend that this is going to be a long-term project. In the data validation tab, under list, let's mix it up. I'm going to pick from the list this time. List of test periods is what we're looking for. I can choose test 1, test 2, test 3 for example. Let's say I had 10 sets of data. I might want to choose test 1 and test 2 to go baseline, test 5 and then test 8 for example. Who knows what the circumstances of your report might be. So now what I have to do is find where, for this athlete, test 1, test 2 and test 3 live in the data table. To make that a bit easier to work with, I'm going to make a narrow little column here called row. So the question is, how do I find the correct row for Gary Park's test 1? I could use a helper column to do that. So let's go to the database, insert a column, call it helper, and do a cell combo, which is the equal sign, the athlete name, and the test label. And that populates all the way down. Hide that away, go to our formula report, and we're pretty much in business. We need to match athlete name with whatever test we have selected in column A. Where are we going to look for it? In our database helper column. Tells us it's in row 4. If I drag that down, it's giving us the other ones as well. Notice there's a bit of an error there, so we could put if error in front and empty quotes at the end, and those error signs would no longer be there. But if we chose test 4, then the number would populate. I think that that's a good way to go. Now, because this is a flexible table and we've got the ability to choose our test, we also need to find out what column each of these measures can be found in. So we can do another match for that. We want to match 5 meter speed. Where do we want to match it? Not only does this list contain field headings, if you scroll to the bottom, it also contains some special options. One of them is headers. So we're matching where speed 5 meter is in the headers column. That's going to tell us it's the 8th column. If I copy that and paste it above the other ones, we can see that it fills in those column headings for us. And let me just quickly change one and see what happens. So it updates, so that's great. So we've now got a dynamic reporting table. And our task is actually quite easy. Use the index function. We're looking in the database table. In this case, we need to specify a column, which is date. And we just click on here, which is the row number. And we copy that down for 5 rows. Let's ignore that error for now. Change it to a date format. And it's all populating nicely. If I change this to a different athlete, those dates will stay the same because they're all tested on the same date, but we can see the rows updating. Now this index function is going to be a little bit different. We're not going to specify the column inside the formula. We're just going to select the entire table because we have both the row number, which can be found here. Put a $sign in front of the B so that it allows me to drag it around. And we have the column number as well. This time I need a $sign in front of the 4. And if I drag this to the right and I drag this down, center it up a bit, and just for simplicity choose number format, we've now got a nice dynamic table that allows me to choose a different measure and have it populate. So that's great if we want to be able to decide what goes in our table. Anything that changes here, it's going to look for a row that matches. And a different athlete means that different data appears. We can see that Mike only tested test 1, test 2 and test 4. So there's a few ways we could get rid of those errors. If I select this entire table and I go to conditional formatting, I can add a new rule. Format only cells that contain errors. And make the font white. That's one way to do it. The errors are still there, we just can't see them because the white font fades into the background. I mentioned previously that I like formula-driven reports because you can do a bit of work around the sides to make it look the way you want and make it behave the way you want. And one of those things that I like about it is the ability to add aggregated data to it. So I'm going to put something up here and demonstrate what I mean with that. First thing I want to pull in is their position. Just by matching the first instance of this athlete's name in the table. This doesn't quite work if you have position changes across a period of time. You might rig this up differently, but in my particular case, if I choose a different athlete, I'm going to automatically get that position update for us. So I could either above or below this table add some information about the position average. If I want to do the average of a user-defined field, I've got to think a little bit more carefully. Average if is the function we need. The range is easy. That's position. Our criteria is easy because that's decided up here, and if I put the F4 key down, that'll lock it in. But our average range is a little bit tricky. We need to use the index function to refer to a particular column in the database, and that column has been determined up here. By putting 2 commas in that index function, it skips over the row argument, and that means it's going to look at all rows in that particular column, and that's what we're looking for. It's quite a neat trick. If I hit enter now, that's the position average for defenders for speed 5 meters throughout the entire table. If I copy that and paste it in, we can see that that updates nicely. And once again, if I try something else like body weight, the data updates, and so does the position average. So let's choose a different athlete, fill in 4 test sets, and we've got a position average which matches up that data. We could format a little bit better, but we could also put in things such as the team average or a player target. So I'll have a look at that in our next video, and I'll also show you how you might extract just the most recent test data rather than having to choose which data sets each time.